Hey guys, it's Miss Benson, and this is going to be the solutions video for the practice FRQ on bank balance sheets. So in this question, we're looking at the bank balance sheet of Sewell Bank. Notice that on the asset side, we have a lot of the categories that we were used to seeing in our notes and on our practice worksheet. On the liability side, all we have is demand deposits and owner's equity. Now the first part, Part A, wants us to calculate the required reserve ratio that Sewell Bank needs to hang on to from its demand deposits. Well, that's pretty easy. Remember that the bank is required to keep a certain percentage of money on hand from checking accounts or demand deposits. Notice that there are $10,000 in the demand deposits or the checking accounts at Sewell Bank, and it has $2,000 in required reserves. So if we wanted to calculate this and show an equation for how we found this 20%, we would do 2,000, the required reserves, over the amount that's in the checking deposit, 10,000. 2,000 over 10,000, that's going to be 20%. Part B says, suppose that the Federal Reserve buys $5,000 worth of bonds from Sewell Bank. Remember that buying bonds means that we're putting the money back into the hands of banks and customers, thereby increasing the money supply. Now what we have to figure out on this part is how is that $5,000 purchase of bonds going to impact the excess reserves and the amount of money in demand deposits. All right, first let's talk about excess reserves. This $5,000 is going right into that bucket of excess reserves. The bank does not have to hold any portion back of that $5,000 because that $5,000 is not going into any checking account. When the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the bank, it just goes directly to the bank. It doesn't go into somebody's checking account. So that means that when the Fed buys $5,000 worth of bonds from this bank, it is buying that $5,000 worth of little paper from the bank, and it's giving $5,000 directly to the bank in their bucket for excess reserves for them to loan out. So the excess reserves would increase by $5,000. Now what would happen to demand deposits? Absolutely nothing, right? Because when the Federal Reserve buys these bonds, that $5,000 is not going into any checking account. It's just going straight into excess reserves. So there's no change in demand deposits. Now Part C tells us to calculate the total impact or the maximum amount that the money supply can change as a result of this $5,000 purchase of bonds by the Federal Reserve. Well, if we want to know the overall total impact, we're going to have to find the money multiplier. Remember that the money multiplier is 1 over the reserve ratio. That's going to be 1 over 0.2 or 1 over 1/5. So our multiplier is going to be 5. Now, the bank does not have to hold any of this $5,000 in required reserves because like we just said, it's not going into checking account. The whole thing is going into excess reserves, so the bank's going to be able to lend out this entire $5,000. That's the amount that's going to be going into the circular flow model when the banks loan this money out. So we're going to do the whole 5,000 times our multiplier of 5, and the total impact or the maximum increase in the money supply as a result of this $5,000 purchase of bonds by the Fed is $25,000. Make sure since it says calculate, you actually show 5,000 times 5 equals 25,000. Part D says when the Fed purchases these bonds, what's going to happen to the price of bonds in the open market? And we have to just kind of explain. Well, we know that whenever the Fed buys bonds, that's going to increase the money supply, which is going to shift the money supply curve to the right on the money market graph. When the money supply curve shifts to the right, that's going to lower nominal interest rates. And we know that there's an inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices. So if interest rates fall, bond prices are going to increase. All right, so Part E says, suppose instead of the Federal Reserve buying $5,000 of bonds, suppose somebody just comes along to the bank and they just deposit $5,000 into their checking account. It says, what's going to be the immediate effect on the M1 money supply? This person had $5,000 in cash in their pocket, which is liquid money, M1 money supply. And they're walking into the bank and they're putting it into their checking account, which is also M1 money supply. So the amount in M1 money supply doesn't change at all. All that altered was the form of M1 money that it was. The $5,000 was cash at first, and now it's $5,000 in a checking account. But we know that cash and checking account money, they're both in M1, so there's no change in M1. Alrighty guys, Hope you felt pretty good about this bank balance sheets practice free response. We'll be doing more practice, and it definitely is a possibility that you could have one of these as a free response question. All right, until next time, see you guys.